Whether you've been making beats for a day or a decade, right now there are probably sounds that you aren't using in your beats that could definitely help improve them. And that's exactly what this video is about. I'm going to cover every single sound that you need to know about for beat making and give you some ideas on how to use them. And just as a disclaimer, these are not absolute rules that you must obey, but more so just a way to broaden your toolkit and give you some ideas. So please do not be like this guy.
Hey, that's not the way I use flutes when I make music. This Navie guy's a complete liar.
Anyways, what we're going to be doing is covering these sounds by type and talk about how to use each type of sound in different situations when making beats. So let's go ahead and jump right in. We'll do this alphabetically. So let's start with basses. And by the way, I'm going to be using a variety of plugins to cover all these sounds, so even if you don't have a particular plugin that I use, or you're using an entirely different beat making program, mostly all plugins and programs have the exact same types or categories of sounds. So this applies to you no matter what you're using. Anyways, back to basses. A very common sound in hip hop and just in music in general, these are sounds that you use to fill up the low end, but not every bass sound is going to be a good fit for your beats. For beat making, using basses that are a bit more heavy in the low end and a bit less colorful in the high end will be a good idea. So using acoustic fingered basses like this, a big booming 808 like this, and even slightly more colorful synth basses that are a bit shorter in length like this. These are all common sounds in beat making depending on the subgenre that you're making. Whereas there are types of basses that you will want to avoid entirely. For example, in a lot of your plugins, many of the basses will be these huge dense synth basses like these ones here. Now you may want to avoid these really colorful basses because these are designed for other genres where the bass is often used to fill up a lot more space in a song. Whereas with hip hop production, a larger variety of sounds are commonly used to make a beat complete, so it can be helpful for a bass to be a little bit less colorful and huge to make space for other sounds. And by the way, if you want a more detailed deep dive into which types of basses work best for which type of beat you're trying to make, check out the video that should be showing up in the corner right now, and I will also leave a link to that video in the description box as well. Next up, we have bells. And also I want to say, if you enjoy my videos and get a lot of value out of them, think about subscribing and hitting the like button. It really does help my channel out. And if you get bored of my videos, just unsubscribe. It's really easy to do. So bells are great sounds that we can use in a variety of different ways, as shorter, pluckier, colorful sounds to help build the melody of your beat, or as longer, more spacey sounds to build your chords if we play them at a lower pitch. You'll notice that most bell sounds start off colorful and then transition into being less present and more spacey as you hold your note down. That initial impact, that color, is what's important because it can help you actually take your sound and make it cut through in your beat and sound more present, which is why these types of sounds are more commonly used for your melodies. So let me show you an example of the sound in an actual beat. Here is a little remix that I made.
Same steps, some days I wake up brain dead. Hook me up on life support. Will somebody tell me what I'm fighting for?
You can hear the bells as the melodic component for this section of the beat, and they really cut through because of this initial part of the sound right here. Having said that, these types of sounds can be versatile. What I like to do at times is go into the preset and turn the attack up, and that way we lose that initial strike. Just an additional idea for you to think about. Next up, we have brass. Now this is going to be a tricky one because most of the brass sounds that you probably have in your plugins are sounds that you should avoid using in your beats. The reason why is because most brass sounds are very synthetic sounding. Personally, in my decades of listening to beats, I don't really hear these types of brasses being used, and unfortunately, this is the way that most brasses sound in many plugins. Now, in terms of which type of brass would fit hip-hop production, that would be the more acoustic brasses like this one here. But sometimes you'll find that if you try to use them, they can still sound kind of weak and thin. So what you can do to get your brasses to sound better is to treat them like an actual band playing them, programming multiple brasses to play different things. This can be a great way to actually get them to sound right in your beats. An example of this is Aiden Kenway's video on remaking Industry Baby. He does a great job of explaining this exact idea. Great YouTube channel in general. I will link that video in the description box below as well. After this, we have drums, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Hip hop uses a lot of different styles of drums, from more electronically generated drums like these ones here, to drums that sound more like they're from an old school drum break taken from an older recording. In terms of drums that don't fit, ironically enough, using drums that sound like they're from an actual recorded drum set is not very common, like these ones here. To get these types of sounds to fit into your beat, you would likely have to do a lot of processing and use a lot of different effects to get them to fit, which might not be worth the hassle if you're just starting out. What I recommend is to just download sample packs. You can find plenty of great free drum packs online. My free drum kit's available in the description box below if you want to give that a test. And once again, if you want a deep dive into which types of drums fit into which types of beats, check out the video in the corner that I made on drums. The link to that will also be in the description box below. In terms of how to use them, one tip that I always give to producers as a starting point is to just place a kick on the 1, so that's right here, and a snare on the 2 and the 4. And this is a sort of framework, a start point for your drum patterns. A mistake many newer producers make is they try to get super expressive and experimental with their drum note placement and put these notes in random places, and this just ends up ruining many beats. Start simple is my advice. Next up, we have guitars and other plucked sounds in general. Very versatile sounds, they can be used for a number of different things, which make them really useful. Having said that, they might be very hit or miss depending on your plugin. In terms of actually getting them to sound good, you may need to do a little bit of processing because many of these will just sound raw. So using things like reverbs, delays, saturation tools, these are things that can help you take it from a raw sound like this into something that more fits a hip-hop beat. Now, guitars can be used for a lot of different elements in your beats, but it is important to pay attention to the small details. For one, the different note velocities that you use can determine a lot in how your guitar actually sounds, as you can hear. Velocities can affect more than just the volume of the sound. The tone can completely change depending on your velocities. Note length will also have an impact on how your guitar feels, so here is an example of something that I programmed for this beat that I made. Now, if I didn't pay attention to the small details like note velocity and length, here's how this would have sounded instead. This just feels a bit more computerized, a bit more lifeless. Also, if you're building chords, strumming the notes where they start slightly one after another can actually help you replicate how a guitar is played. Also consider the modulation knob if you're using a keyboard. It can help you create different types of articulations that can help you prevent your sounds from feeling very computerized. So for example, my keyboard has this little modulation knob over here. And then when I turn it up, you can hear we have a difference in how the note sounds. And by the way, even though I already covered them, this is also true for certain brasses like saxophones as well. The modulation knob can be very helpful in getting your sounds to feel a lot more lifelike. So as you can see, a lot of the small details can go a long way in using these types of sounds. And even though I primarily talked about guitars in this section, I would say that plucked instruments in general, like harps, upright basses, and so on, they have many of these same types of characteristics. The details really matter. Next up, we have mallet type sounds. These are sounds that work similar to bells. The difference here though is that these are typically more acoustic sounds. Sounds like vibraphones, for example, these were very common in older hip hop. And similar to bells, we have that initial impact on the beginning of the sound and that longer tail which becomes less colorful. These types of sounds are very common in beats that used to sample jazz records, so if you want to pursue that type of subgenre and sound to your beats, these types of sounds will be very helpful. Here's an example of that type of sound in an actual beat. And here we have a more vintage style of beat, whereas more modern production leans more towards using synthetic bells that we already covered earlier. But once again, I'm just making a generalization here for the sake of this tutorial. Feel free to use these sounds creatively whichever way you like. After this, we have organs. These are very useful sounds because they can really help you fill up a lot of space in your beats. If you're looking to build out a chord progression, for example, organs can be a great choice. So here's an example of one. As you can hear, we can really introduce that warmth into our beat using these types of sounds. We also have the more vintage traditional organ sounds like so. And here is an example of a beat with an organ actually in it. So the way that I view organs is that they are related to pianos, a sound that I will cover shortly. These are two types of sounds that are often used to build out the underlying chord progressions in many beats. A big difference though is the shape of an organ. If you hold a note down, it will continue to play as long as the note is held, and it has that consistent tone throughout the entire note. Pianos, on the other hand, you have that initial strike and then that slow fade away. So that's going to be a factor in your decision to use these sounds or not. If you already have many other sounds in your beat that take up a lot of room, just know that organs can take up a lot of space in your beats as well, so be aware. Next up, we have pads and or strings. These types of sounds are not used as often in beat making in terms of being the actual focal point of the beat, but they can be really useful for a secondary sound for layering. These types of sounds can often be very spacey. They have a long attack as well as a long release, meaning when you play a note, it doesn't have that initial impact, and when you let go of your note, it will still continue to play. It has a long tail to it. So these types of sounds can easily end up taking a lot of space in your beats if you're not careful. But as I mentioned, these aren't necessarily sounds that would be used as a primary driving force of your beat if we're talking about hip hop production. Unless you were trying to make a more ambient, spacey type of beat, then in that case, these types of sounds will be your best friend. And here's an example of a beat where one of the primary sounds is a pad. Notice that even though the note should be playing, the sound itself is really dragging and not playing with the exact same timing that these notes in the piano roll are. There's a lot of blending and spillover in terms of when one note should start and when it should finish. And that's because, like I mentioned, that high attack and high release time is really affecting when these sounds are actually going to play. But yeah, as you can hear, this is a pretty spacey beat, so for beats like these, pads can be really helpful. Other than that, these types of sounds will be more so a secondary layer for beat making. Percussion is up next. These are sounds that can be really useful in conjunction with your drum patterns. Often they're used as a way to add an additional rhythmic layer into your beat, but you could use them as a tool for layering underneath your drums to help thicken them up as well. In terms of where you could find these sounds, I would once again advise that it might be a better idea to download sound packs. The reason being is that many of these percussive sounds that you'll find in most plugins lead more towards sounds like this. Not exactly what we want for beat making. We are looking for things like side sticks, rim shots, cowbells, shakers, like so. Just smaller, shorter, transient sounds that have some processing on them, rather than these more live, acoustic, orchestral types of percussion sounds that you will find in many of your plugins. Now we move on to pianos. I've talked about them a bit already, but I want to cover two different types of pianos that you'll want to consider. We have acoustic pianos and electric pianos. Both are very popular sounds and have been very prominent throughout hip-hop production for a long time. You're probably used to hearing acoustic pianos. These work very well when it comes to beat making, especially if you apply some type of tape emulation to them, so they might not sound quite as live and become more sample-esque. But as you will hear, once again, certain sounds are better than others. Often with many cheaper or free plugins, the sounds that they produce will not sound great. For example, this preset here is called Realistic, as you can see up here, but yet when I play it, not a very realistic piano. This is not the type of sound that you would hear often in hip hop. And so you're probably starting to see a running theme here where for certain types of instruments that are meant to be a little bit more acoustic, you may need more specialized plugins to actually get them to sound real. A lot of the cheaper or stock plugins that come with your beat making program won't do a good job of providing you with usable sounds if this is the type of direction you want to go. And unfortunately, the plugins that do a good job of emulating these types of sounds can get really expensive. So what you could do instead is download a one-shot, a single note sample, and use this to create whatever you want. Many of these one-shots can sound pretty great, And by the way, if you need help and want the best tips for how to use these types of one-shot samples, once again, I recommend checking out the video in the corner. The link will be in the description box as well. But there are other kinds of pianos that work well with beat making, which are electric pianos. And luckily, many of the stock and cheaper plugins actually do a good job of replicating electric pianos. So here's one for example. But even stock plugins can do a pretty decent job. Now the way that I think about electric pianos is that they're somewhat halfway between acoustic pianos and organs. They're similar to organs in that often they have the same type of overall shape, where as long as you hold down a single note, it will continue to play. How they differ from organs though is that the tone isn't completely uniform typically. You'll remember with our organ, as long as I held my note down, it was the exact same tone throughout the entire note. Whereas with electric pianos, you have that colorful part in the beginning, and then it becomes less colorful while it continues to play. So it has characteristics of both an acoustic piano and an organ in that way. It has the long sustain of an organ, but also has that layer of color that slowly fades away within it, just like a normal piano note would. These sounds are very common and just great sounds to use to build out your chords or your melodic ideas. And finally, we have synth sounds. It's hard to give general advice here since the category of synth is extremely broad. I think this category is a place where you can find a lot of great experimental ideas to introduce into your beats. Whether it be taking a synth like this to build the melodic layer in your beat, or taking the exact same sound, pitching it way down, and creating a unique type of bass. There are definitely synths that you can find that will sound great in beat making, and yet there are also synths like this that just will not fit. To me, synths are where I go if I want to explore sounds that might be a little bit more unique and left field. So this can be a category of sound that you can explore if you want to try something new. Here is an example of a beat that I made that pretty much exclusively uses all sounds from synths. Very weird beat, as you can hear. Whenever I want to make stuff like this, I start by exploring the synth area of my plugin and see what types of unique sounds that I can find. So those are the most important types of sounds that one would need to know to make beats. Let me know if you think I missed a type of sound in the comments below. And even though I covered these sounds in a general way, go ahead and explore. Hip hop is known to be very experimental, so new ideas are always great to hear. This video is just meant to give you some initial ideas to start with. If you enjoyed this video though, like and subscribe. Like I mentioned, my free drum kit is available in the description box below, and if you want to join my producer community, the link to the Discord is down below as well. Check out my full online beat making course, Better Beat Maker, and other than that, I will see you guys next time.